Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahey, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where we take the tools from LSAT Logical Reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in law, politics, economics, and public debate. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's owned and administered by LSAC. I'm not affiliated with LSAC, I just teach the logic. Today's episode is a little bit different. Instead of breaking down a news story or press release, I want to step back and talk about the common types of LSAT logical reasoning questions and why we should care about those forms of inquiry outside the test. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The LSAT isn't really teaching you how to take a test. At its best, it's teaching you how arguments work, and more importantly, how they fail. Let's start with one of the most common question types, necessary assumptions. On the LSAT, the question usually asks something like, which of the following must be true for the argument to hold? In real life, that translates to a much more powerful question. What has to be true for this claim to make sense? Every policy proposal, every economic forecast, every "this study proves" headline, they all rest on unstated premises. If someone argues that raising corporate taxes will increase revenue, what has to be true? Well, that companies won't dramatically change behavior, that capital won't flee, and that enforcement will be effective. If someone argues that cutting taxes will spur growth, what must be true? Well, that the marginal investment response is large enough to offset revenue loss, for one. The world runs on these sort of hidden premises. The LSAT trains you to surface them. And here's the key insight. If the unstated assumption fails, the argument collapses, no matter how confident the speaker may sound. Confidence is not itself a premise. Another staple, flaw questions. These ask you to identify what's wrong in the reasoning. Not whether you agree with the conclusion, not whether you like the policy, but whether the structure of the argument holds. Does the argument confuse correlation with causation? Does it assume what it's trying to prove? Does it apply a double standard? This matters because most real-world arguments are not wrong on the surface. They're wrong in structure. A politician cites rising crime after a reform and declares the reform caused it. That's post hoc reasoning. A commentator dismisses incomplete data when it hurts their case, but relies on that same incomplete data when it helps. That's selective skepticism. Flaw analysis forces a kind of intellectual discipline. You're not allowed to say, I don't like this. You have to say, here is precisely where the logic fails. That's a higher bar, and frankly, public discourse could probably use one. And then there are strengthen and weaken questions. On the LSAT, you're given an argument and you're asked, which new piece of information would make it more convincing or less? Translated into real life, this becomes one of the most important habits of mind. What evidence would actually change my view? If the answer is none, you're not reasoning, you're defending. In economic policy debates, this is crucial. Would new data showing behavioral responses alter the tax analysis? Would evidence of administrative failure change a regulatory stance? Strength and weaken thinking forces intellectual humility. It reminds us that arguments exist in a world of uncertainty. Evidence moves conclusions, or at least it should. If your position cannot, in principle, be weakened by new facts, it's not an argument, it's an identity. The LSAT also loves causation questions. An argument observes two things occurring together and concludes one caused the other. But causation requires more than sequence. It requires mechanism. It requires ruling out of alternatives, and it requires control. In law, this is proximate cause. In economics, it's identification strategy. In policy, it's the difference between symbolism and impact. Did a tax cut increase wages, or did wages rise because of broader macroeconomic trends? Did a regulation reduce risk, or did the risk decline for unrelated reasons? The LSAT teaches you to ask, what else could explain this? That question alone eliminates a shocking amount of bad reasoning. And yet another common LSAT move are scope shifts. A small premise leads to a sweeping conclusion. A limited study becomes proof of systemic failure. A short-term trend becomes a permanent rule. A narrow anecdote becomes a universal principle. On the test, that's a flaw. In the real world, it's how overconfident policies get built. The discipline here is proportionality. Does the evidence justify the breadth of the claim? If not, you don't necessarily reject the conclusion, you just have to scale it. So why does any of this matter beyond law school admissions? Well, because the world is saturated with arguments. Every budget proposal, every regulatory change, every viral headline and confident thread on social media. The question is never just, do I agree? The question is really, what are the premises? Is the reasoning valid? What would strengthen it? What would weaken it? And is the conclusion proportionate to the evidence? That's LSAT thinking. And here's the irony. People sometimes complain that the LSAT is abstract, artificial, or detached from reality. But what could be more practical than learning how to evaluate claims under certainty? Strip away the time pressure and the multiple choice format and maybe some of the biases in the questions, and what remains is something fundamental, intellectual consistency. Apply the same evidentiary standards to arguments you like and arguments you dislike. demand proportionate proof for proportionate claims, and always ask what must be true for this to work. Because logic isn't just for test day, it's for every decision where the stakes are real. And with that, I get off my soapbox, and I thank you for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe for more short breakdowns, and they will actually be short breakdowns where we apply clean reasoning to messy public questions. See you next time.